Sarah Martinez had always been the kind of woman who turned heads when she walked into a room. Her warm smile and friendly nature made people gravitate toward her naturally. She worked as a nurse at the local hospital, where patients and colleagues alike appreciated her caring personality. At 28, she had built a life she was proud of, filled with meaningful work and genuine friendships. When she met David Thompson at a coffee shop near the hospital, she thought she had found her perfect match. David was handsome, successful, and seemed completely devoted to her. He worked as a marketing manager for a large company and appeared to have his life together. During their courtship, he showered her with attention, flowers, and romantic gestures that made her feel like the most important person in the world. Their whirlwind romance lasted 8 months before David proposed. Sarah was swept off her feet by his grand gesture at the restaurant where they had their first official date. He got down on one knee in front of everyone, presenting her with a beautiful diamond ring. The other diners applauded, and Sarah felt like she was living in a fairy tale. She said yes without hesitation, believing she had found her soulmate. The wedding was everything Sarah had dreamed of. David spared no expense, insisting on the best venue, the most beautiful flowers, and a guest list that included everyone important to both of them. Sarah's family and friends were thrilled for her, commenting on how lucky she was to have found such a devoted husband. David's speeches about love and commitment brought tears to many eyes, including Sarah's own. During their honeymoon in Italy, David was the perfect husband. He planned every detail of their trip, from romantic dinners overlooking the Mediterranean to surprise visits to art galleries and historical sites. Sarah felt cherished and loved in ways she had never experienced before. When other men would glance at her or try to start conversations, David would smoothly intervene, wrapping his arm around her possessively but in a way that seemed romantic, rather than controlling. The first few months of marriage continued in this blissful bubble. David would surprise Sarah with lunch at the hospital, send flowers to her workplace, and insist on picking her up after her shifts. Her colleagues teased her about having such an attentive husband, and Sarah beamed with pride. She felt protected and adored, interpreting his constant presence as proof of his deep love for her. However, small changes began to emerge that Sarah initially dismissed as David adjusting to married life. He started asking detailed questions about her day at work, wanting to know about every interaction she had with male colleagues or patients. When she mentioned Dr. Peterson, a kind older physician who had become something of a mentor to her, David's jaw would tighten slightly. He would ask pointed questions about their conversations and whether Dr. Peterson had ever complimented her work. Sarah noticed that David had opinions about her friendships too. When she wanted to meet her college friend Lisa for dinner, David would suggest they invite Lisa and her boyfriend over to their house instead. When Sarah's male colleague from nursing school, Mike, called to catch up, David would hover nearby during the conversation, listening to every word. If Sarah laughed at something Mike said, David would later ask what was so funny, his tone carrying an edge she hadn't noticed before. The changes were so gradual that Sarah convinced herself she was imagining things. David was still loving and attentive, still bringing her coffee in bed every morning and telling her how beautiful she was. When she tried to bring up his behavior, he would look hurt and confused, asking if she didn't appreciate how much he cared about her. He would remind her of all the ways he showed his love, making her feel guilty for questioning his motives. One evening, after Sarah had worked a particularly long shift at the hospital, she came home to find David waiting for her with a serious expression. He sat her down on their living room couch and took her hands in his voice gentle but firm as he spoke about his concerns for her safety. He had been reading about the dangers that nurses faced, particularly from unstable patients or aggressive visitors. He worried about her walking to her car alone after late shifts, about the unpredictable people she encountered in the emergency room. David painted a picture of a world full of threats that Sarah had somehow been blind to. He spoke about male patients who might become obsessed with their pretty nurse, about colleagues who might take advantage of her trusting nature. His concern seemed so genuine, his love so evident in every word that Sarah found herself nodding along. Maybe she had been naive about the potential dangers in her workplace. Maybe David's protective instincts were exactly what she needed. The weeks passed. David's concerns seemed to multiply. He worried about her walking alone anywhere, about strangers approaching her when she was out shopping, about the intentions of repairmen or delivery drivers who came to their house. Each worry was presented with such care and backed up with news stories or statistics he had researched online. Sarah began to see potential threats everywhere, grateful to have a husband who was so vigilant about protecting her. The transformation in Sarah's perception was so subtle that she didn't realize how much her world had begun to shrink. She started calling David to pick her up from work instead of driving herself. She stopped going out alone for errands, preferring to wait until David could accompany her. When friends invited her to social gatherings, she would automatically check with David first, and somehow there always seemed to be a reason why it wasn't a good idea for her to go. David's love felt overwhelming and all-consuming, wrapping around Sarah like a warm blanket that gradually became tighter and more restrictive. But to Sarah, it still felt like love. It still felt like protection. It still felt like having a husband who cared about her more than anything else in the world. She had no idea that this was only the beginning of a journey that would fundamentally change everything she thought she knew about love, marriage, and herself. 6 months into their marriage, David's protective behavior began to evolve into something more controlling, though Sarah was still unable to see it clearly. What started as concern for her safety gradually transformed into detailed monitoring of her daily activities. David bought her a new phone, explaining that the GPS feature would help him find her quickly if there was ever an emergency. He installed tracking apps that he claimed would give them both peace of mind. The hospital where Sarah worked became David's primary focus of concern. He began researching her male colleagues online, finding reasons to worry about each one. Dr. Peterson, who had always been a father figure to Sarah, suddenly became suspicious in David's eyes. David discovered that Dr. Peterson had gone through a divorce 2 years earlier, and used this information to suggest that the older man might be looking for a younger woman to fill the void in his life. Sarah found herself defending her colleagues and friends, but David's arguments were always logical and seemingly well-intentioned. He never raised his voice or became obviously angry. Instead, he would present his concerns with the calm rationality of someone who had clearly thought everything through. He would show her articles about workplace harassment, statistics about married women who had affairs with colleagues, and stories about predatory behavior in medical settings. The pressure was so subtle that Sarah barely noticed how she began to change her behavior to avoid these conversations. She stopped mentioning her interactions with male colleagues unless absolutely necessary. When Dr. Peterson complimented her work on a particularly challenging case, she kept the praise to herself rather than share it with David as she once would have. She began to see her workplace through David's suspicious lens, second-guessing the motivations behind every friendly gesture or professional compliment. David's surveillance extended beyond just tracking her location. He began checking her phone, regularly reading through her text messages and call logs. He explained this as wanting to stay connected to her life, to be part of everything that was important to her. When Sarah expressed discomfort with this invasion of privacy, David would look wounded and remind her that married couples shouldn't have secrets from each other. The isolation happened so gradually that Sarah almost didn't notice. First, David suggested they spend more evenings at home together instead of going out with friends. He would plan special dinners or surprise activities that coincidentally conflicted with social invitations. When Sarah's friend Lisa called to invite her to a girls' night out, David would have already planned a romantic evening at home. When her nursing school friends organized a reunion, David would have booked a weekend getaway for just the two of them. Sarah's world began to revolve entirely around David and their home. He encouraged her to work fewer hours, suggesting that she was overworking herself and that the stress wasn't good for her health or their marriage. He could support them financially, he reasoned. So why should she exhaust herself with overtime shifts? The logical arguments always made sense, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something important was slipping away from her. Her confidence at work began to suffer as well. Without the casual interactions and friendships that had once energized her, Sarah felt increasingly isolated, even when surrounded by colleagues. She second-guessed her professional relationships, wondering if David was right about the hidden motives of the people around her. The job that had once brought her so much satisfaction began to feel like a source of stress and confusion. David filled the void left by Sarah's diminishing outside relationships with increased attention and affection. He would surprise her with elaborate gestures of love, expensive gifts, and romantic vacations to exotic locations. These moments were magical and reminded Sarah why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. When doubts crept into her mind about his controlling behavior, these grand demonstrations of love would sweep them away. The couple's social life became entirely managed by David. He would organize dinner parties at their home, carefully selecting the guest list to include only people he approved of. These were usually couples where the other husbands shared David's traditional views about marriage and the importance of protecting one's wife. The conversations at these gatherings reinforced David's perspective, with other men nodding approvingly. When he spoke about keeping Sarah safe from the dangers of the modern world, Sarah began to lose touch with her own instincts and desires. When friends called, she would automatically think about whether David would approve of the plans before considering whether she actually wanted to participate. Her responses to invitations became increasingly vague and non-committal. People began to assume she was simply busy with her new marriage, not realizing that she was slowly disappearing from her own life. The financial control started subtly as well. David suggested they combine all their accounts for simplicity, which seemed reasonable for a married couple. He took over managing their finances, explaining that his business background made him better suited for handling investments and budgeting. Sarah's paychecks were deposited into their joint account, but David managed all the expenditures. He gave her a credit card for personal expenses, but he reviewed every purchase, always with curiosity rather than accusation. When Sarah wanted to buy something without discussing it first, she felt guilty and sneaky, as if she were doing something wrong. David never explicitly forbade her from making purchases, but his questions about every expense made her increasingly hesitant to spend money independently. The financial dependence grew gradually, but it was another thread in the web that was slowly tightening around Sarah's independence. Despite all these changes, Sarah still believed she was in a loving marriage. David's explanations for his behavior always sounded reasonable, and his love for her seemed genuine and intense. The isolation felt like intimacy, the control felt like protection, and the monitoring felt like devotion. Sarah had no reference point for understanding that love shouldn't feel suffocating, that protection shouldn't require imprisonment, and that devotion shouldn't demand the sacrifice of one's entire identity. The warning signs were all there, but Sarah couldn't see them clearly through the fog of manipulation and genuine affection that surrounded her daily life. She was like a frog in slowly boiling water, unable to recognize the danger because the changes happened so gradually. Her world had shrunk to the size of her marriage, but she still believed this was what true love looked like. By their first wedding anniversary, Sarah's life had become completely unrecognizable from the independent, vibrant woman she had been just a year earlier. David's control had tightened like a noose around every aspect of her existence, yet she remained convinced that his behavior stemmed from an overwhelming love for her. The anniversary celebration itself was a perfect example of how David had learned to disguise control as romance. Instead of allowing Sarah to plan any part of their anniversary celebration, David arranged everything himself. He booked a secluded cabin in the mountains, far from cell phone towers and other people. When Sarah expressed a mild preference for celebrating at the beach resort they had talked about, David explained that the isolation would allow them to focus entirely on each other without distractions. He presented this as the ultimate romantic gesture, a chance for them to reconnect away from the pressures of the outside world. During their anniversary weekend, Sarah realized she couldn't remember the last time she had made a decision about anything significant in her life. David chose their vacation destinations, their social activities, even the restaurants where they ate dinner. When she tried to suggest alternatives, he would listen patiently and then explain why his choice was better for various logical reasons. His arguments were always persuasive, and Sarah found herself agreeing even when something inside her resisted. The isolation at work had become complete. Sarah's colleagues had stopped inviting her to professional development workshops or social gatherings because she never attended. Dr. Peterson, who had once been a mentor and friend, now treated her with polite professionalism, but no longer shared interesting cases or offered career advice. Sarah told herself this was natural as she had been married for a year, but deep down she felt the loss of these professional relationships. David had convinced Sarah to reduce her working hours to part-time, arguing that the stress of full-time nursing was affecting her health and their marriage. The financial sacrifice seemed minimal since David's income was substantial, and he presented the change as an opportunity for Sarah to focus on things that truly mattered. Without the structure and social interaction of full-time work, Sarah found herself spending most of her days alone in their house, waiting for David to return home. The house itself had become both a sanctuary and a prison. David had installed an elaborate security system that monitored every entrance and window. He explained this as necessary protection for Sarah when she was home alone, but the system also tracked whenever doors were opened and closed. Sarah couldn't leave the house without David knowing exactly when she had gone and when she returned. The security cameras positioned around the property meant that David could check on her throughout the day from his office. Sarah's few remaining friendships were managed entirely through David's approval system. When Lisa called to invite her for coffee, Sarah automatically told her she would need to check with David first. This response had become so natural that Sarah didn't even realize how strange it sounded to others. Lisa had tried several times to point out that Sarah seemed different, but these conversations always ended with Sarah defending David and explaining how lucky she was to have such a caring husband. The psychological manipulation had become more sophisticated as David learned exactly which buttons to push to maintain control. When Sarah showed any signs of independence or resistance, David would become hurt and distant, making her feel guilty for not appreciating his love and protection. He had perfected the art of making her feel selfish for wanting anything that didn't align with his plans for their life together. David's jealousy had evolved beyond just other men to include anyone or anything that might compete for Sarah's attention or affection. When Sarah expressed interest in adopting a cat from the local shelter, David explained his concerns about pet allergies and the additional responsibilities that would interfere with their couple time. When she mentioned wanting to take an art class at the community college, he worried about the expense and the time it would take away from their marriage. The financial control had become absolute without Sarah fully realizing it. David handled all their bills, investments, and major purchases. Sarah's credit card had a modest limit, and David reviewed every statement carefully, always with curiosity rather than accusation. He never forbade her from buying things, but his questions about every purchase made her increasingly reluctant to spend money without his approval. She had lost access to her own financial independence so gradually that she barely noticed it was gone. Sarah's family had begun to express concerns about the changes they saw in her. Her sister Maria had noticed that Sarah never called anymore, and that when the family gathered for holidays, Sarah seemed anxious and constantly checked her phone for messages from David. When Maria tried to plan a sister's weekend, Sarah explained that David preferred they spend their free time together as a couple, which was natural for newlyweds. The most insidious aspect of David's control was how he had managed to convince Sarah that his behavior was not only normal, but evidence of exceptional love. He would point to divorce statistics and stories of unfaithful spouses to demonstrate how different their marriage was. He regularly told Sarah how lucky they were to have found true love in a world where most couples barely knew each other. This narrative made Sarah feel special and chosen, even as her world continued to shrink. Sarah's sense of self had begun to disappear completely. She couldn't remember what movies she liked to watch, what foods she preferred, or what activities brought her joy independent of David's preferences. Her opinions on everything from politics to vacation destinations had merged completely with his. When people asked her direct questions about her preferences, she would automatically respond with what she knew David would want her to say. The few moments when Sarah felt glimpses of her old self were quickly suppressed by guilt and confusion. Sometimes, while alone in the house, she would remember the satisfaction she used to feel from her nursing work, or the laughter she shared with friends. These memories felt like betrayals of her marriage, and she would push them away. reminding herself how blessed she was to have a husband who loved her so completely. David had created a perfect system of control that felt like love, imprisonment, that felt like protection, and isolation that felt like intimacy. Sarah was completely unaware that she was living in a cage of her husband's making, believing instead that she was living in the safety of his devotion. The trap was so complete and so carefully constructed that Sarah couldn't even see the bars that surrounded her, much less imagine a way to escape them. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon when Sarah was alone in the house, as she was most days now. She had been married for 18 months, and her life had settled into a routine that revolved entirely around David's schedule and preferences. She was folding laundry in their bedroom when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Normally, she would let unknown calls go to voicemail, as David had taught her to be cautious about answering calls from strangers. Something made her answer this time. Perhaps a spark of the curiosity that had once defined her personality. The voice on the other end was familiar yet distant, like an echo from another lifetime. It was Jennifer, a nursing school classmate she hadn't spoken to in over a year. Jennifer was calling because she had just moved back to town and wanted to reconnect with old friends. She had gotten Sarah's number from their mutual friend Mike, who mentioned that Sarah had seemed to drop off the face of the earth after getting married. As Jennifer chatted excitedly about her new job at a different hospital across town, Sarah felt something stir inside her that she had almost forgotten existed. It was the feeling of being seen and known by someone who remembered who she used to be. Jennifer talked about cases she was working on, professional challenges she was facing, and asked Sarah about her current work situation. For the first time, in months, Sarah found herself talking about nursing with genuine enthusiasm. When Jennifer suggested they meet for lunch to catch up properly, Sarah's automatic response was to say she would need to check her schedule. But as the words formed, in her mouth something made her pause. A small voice inside her, one that had been silent for so long she had forgotten it existed, whispered that she didn't need to check with anyone to have lunch with an old friend. Before she could second-guess herself, Sarah agreed to meet Jennifer the following day at a small cafe downtown. After hanging up the phone, Sarah felt an unfamiliar mixture of excitement and anxiety. The excitement came from the prospect of reconnecting with someone from her past, of talking about nursing and remembering who she used to be professionally. The anxiety came from knowing she should tell David about the lunch plans, but also knowing he would find reasons why it wasn't a good idea. For the first time in her marriage, Sarah made the decision to keep something from her husband. The lunch with Jennifer was a revelation that shook Sarah to her core. Sitting across from her old classmate, Sarah was confronted with a mirror that reflected how much she had changed. Jennifer talked about her work with passion and expertise, sharing stories about difficult cases and professional victories. She asked Sarah thoughtful questions about her career development and seemed confused when Sarah's responses were vague and non-committal. Jennifer mentioned that she had tried to reach out several times over the past year, but Sarah had never responded to her messages or calls. Sarah realized with horror that David must have been screening her communications more thoroughly than she had understood. When Jennifer asked why Sarah had become so hard to reach, Sarah found herself making excuses about being busy with married life. But the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. The most shocking moment came when Jennifer casually mentioned that Mike had told her about Sarah's marriage. Jennifer was surprised to learn that none of Sarah's nursing school friends had been invited to the wedding. Sarah tried to explain that they had wanted a small ceremony, but she suddenly couldn't remember making that decision. She realized that the guest list had been entirely David's creation, filled with his friends, colleagues, and family members, with only a handful of Sarah's relatives in attendance. As Jennifer talked about her own life, her career goals, her recent vacation to Europe with girlfriends, and her dating experiences, Sarah felt like she was listening to stories from an alien world. The freedom and independence that Jennifer took for granted seemed impossible to Sarah now. The idea of traveling with friends, making major career decisions, or even choosing where to have lunch without consulting someone else seemed like privileges from another lifetime. When they parted ways, Jennifer hugged Sarah warmly and made her promise to stay in touch this time. She mentioned that several of their old classmates were planning a reunion and wanted Sarah to be part of the organizing committee. The invitation felt both thrilling and terrifying. Sarah promised to think about it, knowing that David would never approve but unable to say no outright. Driving home from the lunch, Sarah felt as if she was seeing her life clearly for the first time in months. The contrast between Jennifer's vibrant, independent existence and her own carefully controlled world was stark and undeniable. She thought about how she used to make decisions quickly and confidently, how she used to have opinions about everything from politics to weekend plans, how she used to feel excited about her future and her career. That evening, when David asked about her day, Sarah lied smoothly and naturally. She talked about cleaning the house, running errands, and preparing dinner. But she didn't mention Jennifer or the lunch. The ease with which the lie came surprised her, and she realized she had been gradually learning to hide parts of herself from her husband without even recognizing it. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself thinking constantly about her conversation with Jennifer. She began to notice things about her life that she had previously accepted without question. She observed how David controlled every conversation, how he made all their social plans, how he had opinions about everything she wore, ate, or wanted to do. She started paying attention to how she felt when he monitored her phone calls or questioned her about her activities. The awareness was painful and disorienting. Sarah felt like someone waking up from a long dream, trying to distinguish between what was real and what had been an illusion. She began to remember the person she used to be before David, and the comparison made her current situation seem surreal. How had she allowed her life to become so small? How had she convinced herself that this level of control was normal or loving? Sarah started conducting small experiments in independence. She would take slightly different routes when running errands, just to prove to herself that she could. She would choose what to watch on television during the day, instead of waiting for David to come home and decide. These tiny acts of autonomy felt both liberating and terrifying, like stolen moments of freedom that she would have to account for if discovered. The most significant change was that Sarah began to see David's behavior with new eyes. His concerned questions about her day now sounded like interrogations. His suggestions about what she should wear or how she should spend her time felt like commands. His romantic gestures began to feel calculated rather than spontaneous, designed to maintain control rather than express love. The protective behavior that had once made her feel cherished now felt suffocating and manipulative. Sarah's newfound awareness created an internal earthquake that shook every foundation of her marriage. The more clearly she could see David's controlling behavior, the more trapped she felt. Every day brought new realizations about how extensively he had manipulated her world, and with each revelation came a deeper understanding of how difficult escape would be. David had systematically dismantled her independence so thoroughly that she wasn't sure she still possessed the skills or confidence to rebuild her life. The financial reality hit her particularly hard when she tried to imagine leaving. David had convinced her to close her individual accounts when they married, and their joint accounts were entirely under his control. Sarah's part-time nursing salary was directly deposited into an account she couldn't access without David's knowledge. She had no savings of her own, no credit in her name, and no clear understanding of their financial situation beyond what David chose to share with her. The social isolation David had engineered was equally devastating. Sarah realized that she had no friends left who would help her leave, no support system independent of David's influence. Her family lived several states away, and David had gradually discouraged regular contact with them by always finding reasons why visits or long phone calls weren't convenient. Her colleagues at work barely knew her anymore since she had reduced her hours and withdrawn from professional relationships. Despite these overwhelming obstacles, Sarah couldn't unsee what she now recognized as her prison. The lunch with Jennifer had awakened something in her that refused to go back to sleep. She began making small plans for independence, knowing that any attempt to leave would need to be carefully orchestrated. She started by secretly researching domestic violence resources online, learning for the first time that what she was experiencing had a name and that other women had found ways to escape similar situations. Reading about emotional abuse and controlling relationships was both validating and terrifying. Sarah recognized her own experiences in every article and survivor story she found. The gradual isolation, the financial control, the monitoring of communications, the manipulation disguised as love. It was all there, described by experts and other survivors with painful accuracy. For the first time, Sarah understood that David's behavior wasn't unique or romantic. It was a calculated pattern of control. The most shocking discovery was learning that controlling behavior often escalated. Over time, Sarah realized that David's jealousy and possessiveness were likely to become more severe, not better. She read stories of women whose partners became physically violent when they sensed their control slipping, and she understood with crystal clarity that her situation was dangerous in ways she had never fully appreciated. Sarah began taking small but significant steps toward independence. She opened a secret email account from the library computer and started researching job opportunities at hospitals in other cities. She slowly began saving small amounts of cash by asking for money back when she bought groceries, hiding the bills in a book David would never think to open. She memorized important phone numbers for domestic violence hotlines and women's shelters, not daring to write them down where David might find them. The hardest part was maintaining the facade of being a happy, compliant wife while secretly planning her escape. Sarah had to pretend that David's controlling behavior still felt like love, that his monitoring still felt like protection. She smiled and agreed with his plans while internally counting the days until she could implement her own. The constant performance was exhausting and emotionally devastating. David seemed to sense some change in Sarah, though he couldn't identify exactly what was different. He increased his surveillance and became more possessive, insisting on driving her to and from her part-time nursing shifts and calling her multiple times during her work hours. He began questioning her more intensively about her activities during the day, looking for inconsistencies in her stories that might reveal secret activities or relationships. Sarah's sister Maria provided an unexpected opportunity when she called to announce her engagement and ask Sarah to be her maid of honor. The wedding was planned for 3 months away in their hometown, and Maria wanted Sarah to come early to help with preparations. David's initial reaction was to find reasons why Sarah couldn't travel alone, but the family pressure and social expectations around the wedding made his objection seem unreasonable even to him. This wedding became Sarah's deadline and her escape route. She realized that once she was in her hometown, surrounded by family and away from David's immediate control, she would have her best opportunity to ask for help and refuse to return. The 3-month timeline gave her enough opportunity to make more concrete plans while maintaining her cover as a devoted wife, counting down to her sister's special day. Sarah began volunteering for additional responsibilities related to the wedding planning, using legitimate reasons to spend time on the phone with her family and to research vendors and locations online. These activities gave her cover for the research and planning she was really doing about starting a new life. She reconnected with family members she hadn't spoken to in months, carefully rebuilding relationships that David had helped her neglect. The nursing shortage at the hospital where she worked provided another unexpected advantage. When her supervisor asked if she could increase her hours temporarily to help cover for a colleague on medical leave, Sarah agreed immediately, despite knowing David would object. She presented it to David as a temporary financial opportunity that would benefit their marriage, playing into his controlling nature by making it seem like his decision. Working more hours gave Sarah access to resources and relationships she desperately needed. She carefully renewed friendships with trusted colleagues, sharing just enough information about her situation to begin building a support network. Dr. Peterson, who had always been kind to her, noticed the changes in her demeanor and gently asked if everything was all right at home. Sarah wasn't ready to tell him everything, but his concern felt like a lifeline she could potentially use later. The most crucial element of Sarah's planning was emotional preparation for the confrontation she knew was coming. David would not let her go easily, and she needed to be ready for the manipulation, threats, and false promises that would inevitably follow her announcement that she was leaving. Sarah practiced conversations in her mind, strengthening her resolve and preparing responses to the arguments she knew David would make. As the wedding approached, Sarah felt a mixture of terror and excitement that reminded her of the person she used to be. The fear was overwhelming, but underneath it was a growing strength and determination that David's control had never quite managed to crush. Sarah was preparing to reclaim her life, knowing that the battle ahead would be the hardest thing she had ever faced, but finally understanding that the alternative was the complete loss of herself. The week before Maria's wedding, David's behavior became increasingly erratic as he sensed the approaching separation. He had agreed to let Sarah travel to her hometown 3 days early to help with wedding preparations, but his anxiety about losing control was palpable. He insisted on driving her to the airport personally and made her promise to call him every few hours while she was away. Sarah agreed to everything, knowing it would be the last time she would ever make such promises. On the plane to her hometown, Sarah felt like she was traveling back in time to reclaim the person she used to be. With every mile that separated her from David, she felt a weight lifting from her chest that she hadn't realized was there. The flight attendant's routine safety demonstration took on special meaning as Sarah contemplated her own emergency exit strategy. She clutched the small bag containing her secretly saved cash and important documents, knowing it represented her chance at freedom. Her family's reaction to seeing her was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. Sarah could see the shock in their eyes as they took in how much she had changed. She had lost weight, her vibrant personality had dimmed, and there was a nervous quality to her behavior that hadn't existed before her marriage. Her mother immediately began fussing over her, insisting she eat more and asking detailed questions about her health and happiness that Sarah deflected with practiced skill. The first night back home, Sarah lay in her childhood bedroom and felt safer than she had in months. The familiar surroundings and the sounds of her family moving through the house reminded her of who she had been before David reshaped her entire identity. She spent the night staring at the ceiling, gathering courage for the conversation she planned to have with her family the next morning. When Sarah finally told her family the truth about her marriage, their reactions ranged from shock to anger to immediate action. Her father wanted to confront David directly, while her mother blamed herself for not recognizing the signs during their brief visits. Maria was devastated to learn that her sister had been suffering in silence, and she immediately offered to postpone the wedding if Sarah needed more time to deal with her situation. Sarah's brother-in-law, who worked as a family lawyer, provided practical advice about divorce proceedings and protective orders. He helped Sarah understand her legal rights and explained the process for reclaiming her financial independence. Most importantly, he assured her that David's behavior constituted emotional abuse and that she had grounds for a divorce that would protect her interests. The hardest part was making the phone call to David to tell him she wasn't coming back. Sarah had rehearsed what she would say dozens of times, but when she heard his voice, all her preparation seemed inadequate. David's initial response was disbelief, then anger, then desperate pleading. He promised to change, to seek counseling, to give her more freedom if she would just come home and work on their marriage. Sarah had anticipated these responses and had prepared herself not to be swayed by them. She told David calmly but firmly that their marriage was over and that she would be filing for divorce. When he demanded to know what had poisoned her mind against him, she explained that no one had influenced her decision except her own growing awareness of how unhappy and controlled she had become. David's threats came next, as Sarah had expected they would. He reminded her that she had no money, no job prospects, nowhere to live, and no friends to help her. He painted a bleak picture of her future without him, describing how difficult it would be for her to rebuild her life from nothing. These threats might have worked on the broken version of Sarah who had existed just weeks earlier, but the woman who had rediscovered her strength was not intimidated. The most manipulative part of David's response was his claim that he had only been trying to protect her because he loved her so much. He insisted that his behavior had been motivated by genuine concern for her safety and well-being, and that she was misinterpreting his care as control. He reminded her of all the ways he had shown his love, all the romantic gestures and expensive gifts, all the attention and devotion that other women would envy. Sarah listened to David's manipulation with a clarity she had never possessed during their marriage. She could hear the calculation behind his words, the practiced techniques he used to make her feel guilty and confused. For the first time, She understood that David's version of love was actually a form of ownership, and that his protection had been a cage designed to keep her captive rather than safe. When David realized that his usual methods weren't working, he became desperate and began making increasingly unrealistic promises. He offered to move to her hometown so she could be closer to her family. He suggested they could both quit their jobs and travel the world together. He promised to delete all the tracking apps from her phone and give her complete financial freedom. Each promise revealed how clearly he understood the ways he had been controlling her, making his previous denial seem even more dishonest. The final phase of David's manipulation involved threats about what would happen if Sarah went through with the divorce. He claimed she would never find another man who would love her as much as he did. He suggested that her family was filling her head with lies, and that she would regret her decision once she realized how difficult life would be without him. He even threatened to contest the divorce and make the process as long and expensive as possible. Sarah ended the phone call by telling David that she would communicate with him only through her lawyer from that point forward. She blocked his number on her phone and changed her email password, cutting off his primary means of continuing his manipulation. The finality of these actions felt both terrifying and liberating, marking the definitive end of the life she had been living and the beginning of an uncertain but hopeful future. Over the following days, David's attempts to regain control became increasingly desperate and invasive. He called Sarah's workplace, her family members, and even tried to book a flight to come after her. Sarah's brother-in-law helped her obtain a temporary restraining order, which legally prohibited David from contacting her or coming near her family. The legal protection felt like armor against the emotional warfare David had waged against her for so long. Maria's wedding became a celebration of more than just her marriage. It was also a celebration of Sarah's freedom and her family's support for her courage. Standing at her sister's side as maid of honor, Sarah felt like she was witnessing not just Maria's new beginning, but her own as well. The contrast between Maria's healthy, supportive relationship and Sarah's toxic marriage was stark and reinforced her decision to leave. The months that followed were challenging in ways Sarah hadn't fully anticipated, but they were also filled with rediscoveries and small victories. Finding a new job at a hospital in her hometown was easier than David had predicted, and her nursing skills had remained sharp despite the isolation she had experienced. Rebuilding her financial independence was slow but steady, and each paycheck deposited into her own account felt like a victory. The hardest part of recovery was learning to trust her own judgment again. David's manipulation had been so thorough that Sarah questioned every decision and second-guessed her own instincts. Therapy helped her understand the psychological damage that had been done and gave her tools for rebuilding her confidence and self-worth. Slowly, she began to remember who she had been before David and to envision who she might become after him. Sarah's divorce was finalized 8 months after she left David, marking the legal end to a marriage that had nearly cost her everything. The settlement gave her a fair share of their joint assets, including enough money to start fresh without financial desperation. David's final letter, delivered through his lawyer, was one last attempt at manipulation. But Sarah read it with the detached interest of someone examining a specimen under a microscope. 2 years after leaving David, Sarah was living a life that felt authentic and joyful in ways she had almost forgotten were possible. She had rebuilt her career, developed new friendships, and even started dating someone who respected her independence and celebrated her strength. The woman who had once been locked away from other men had become someone who chose freely how to share her life and with whom. Sarah's story became a source of hope for other women in similar situations. She began volunteering with domestic violence organizations, helping other women recognize the signs of emotional abuse and find the courage to seek help. Her experience had taught her that love should never require the sacrifice of one's identity, and that true protection comes from building strength, not from accepting limitations. The jealous husband who had tried to lock his wife away from other men had ultimately lost everything he had tried so desperately to control. Sarah had reclaimed not just her freedom but her sense of self, her career, her relationships, and her future. The transformation was complete, but unlike David's manipulation, it had been entirely her choice.